then we can.
All right, so I saw a lot of really amazing things today watching the kids, especially with the modeling. So I had just kind of been taking some notes whenever they were talking and modeling, and just wanted to go over some of those things. I really liked how you started the lesson with having them model it and then asking them, how do we know how many are in the cup? And they answered no. And they're like, well, and they said, no, it's unknown. And you're like, what do we call that? Oh, it's the variable. So coming back to that vocabulary, because I know a lot of them struggle with the vocabulary, especially equation, and we had done expression, and knowing that that was the variable from the start, I think set the rest of the lesson up to be successful. And I also really liked that in that problem, you turned it into a practical problem, because it was a division problem where, we have 2 people and 6 mints. How many mints are each person getting? And without even having to think about the variable itself of throwing it off, they were like, oh, well, everyone gets 3. And then it was easy for them to match it up and see what we were actually doing. So I thought that was really, really good. How did you feel that things went today?
I think they really have a good understanding. I mean, it took a while, but to have them understand, and understand, like you said, be able to go from the, they can divide things up.
Right.
But then when you give them variables, they can't do it.
Right. No, I thought it went really,
and some
really
of the
well.
misconceptions, like putting the division bar underneath the 2 instead of underneath the variable. So it was like, oh, well, what are you dividing? Oh, I'm dividing the number of tokens. So not dividing 2.
Right. And I like that you, I wrote that down, that you referred to them as tokens, because I think that made it, that connection, especially for Jamil, was like, oh, yeah, well, I know then, especially if I'm splitting something up. And I feel like with our students, that's one of the hardest skills, is realizing like multiplication, division with the inverse. Because addition and subtraction, I feel like, for the most part, is, easier. But I thought that was really, really good. I also liked Jamil whenever he said we were dividing by 2, but he's like, oh, you take half of it. So even relating back to like that number sense of knowing like, oh, well, half is 1x. And so I thought that was really good to see too, because he's definitely getting further into his conceptual understanding. So that was really good. Whenever Jamil, the first misconception was whenever you had modeled x plus 1 equals 3, and he had just put the x equals 3. I really liked that you were like, no, read the equation that we're supposed to write. And he read x plus 1 equals 3. And then you said, okay, now read what you wrote. And he looked at it, and I could see that he was thinking like, something's wrong, but I'm not quite sure what's wrong yet. And then he's like, oh, it's plus 1, not 1x. So I really liked that you had him repeat that back, because rather than being like, oh no, add 1 to it. So I like that you let him struggle a little bit through that, because it definitely helped him, because then I wrote down that the second one that you had modeled, or that he was supposed to model, he did it correctly. So he had put that plus 1 in there. Also, I think it was clear whenever I had asked Jamil, like it was like 2x equals a number, and I had asked him why he had put the 2 big pieces instead of the constants down, and he was like, looked at me like I was crazy and was like, because they're an x. He was like, I know that this is, and he picked, and he picked it up and showed me like, well, this is 1x. And I know my problem said I need 2, so I put 2 of them down there. And then he's like, on this side, and was able to point out which were the constants. So I think long term, he's definitely having a lot of concrete, solid foundations to move further, which for being a 6th grader, I was really, really impressed to see. Same thing whenever he was self-correcting throughout, where one was 3x equals 6. He's like, oh, I break it into 2 groups. And then he's like, no. And he had like drawn it out, and he erased it, and you had asked him like, well, why are you changing your answer? He's like, because I have 3 x's. That means I have 3 groups, and then 2 are in each group. So sometimes I think that commutative property, especially in ones that are easy like this, kids get caught up in, but don't realize like, no, that's the number of groups I need, not how many are in each group. The one thing whenever we were doing, I know the negatives get confusing, especially because he missed integers, and I was doing the same thing today with my 6th graders. It was like, oh gosh, we need to go way back to the beginning. So I liked that you had stopped the lesson and you were like, okay, what are these? And you had pulled out the yellow and the red and showed, and then they were like, oh, that equals 0, and had gone back to it. Because I think if you would have just like continued with it without really explaining what those were, he wasn't going to get it. I did think it was interesting. I know Betsy was kind of like guessing and playing around whenever you were like, oh, when it was mine, like adding a -3, you know, do we add 3 or do we subtract it? And then Betsy had decided on subtract. And then Jamil was like, no, I think you add. So I would have been a little curious to hear them like argue why. And I know it's hard here because there's only 2 of them and
Right.
it's, you know, a small group. So really my only question was, how do you think, because you can't really do like a turn and talk because there's 2 of them, but how do you think we could get them, like their discourse just between them? Because Jamil tells you everything, so he knows like what he is saying. But how do you think we could get like Jamil and Betsy to exchange those conversations?
Well, that's like when you give them you give them error analysis problems. That's when they have to really start discussing, because is it wrong? Why is it wrong? And if we give them ones where we say, oh, X equals this amount, and then they have to go back and check, does it equal that? Well, why not? So I think that would give them the talk time.
Yeah, no, I really like that, and I agree, because I think now, you know, building that foundational skill and just him being able to tell you, and when I asked questions, he was like, yeah, and was so clear with his answer. I was really, really impressed, especially since this is his first go around with it, where Betsy's had a little bit of experience with this at some point. So I just want to say that I loved being in your classroom, and thank you so much for helping me out with this project, and I am glad that Equations is going so well.
Thank you.